Cleopatra did not die the moment Egypt fell. She lived through what came after. In August of 30 BC, Roman soldiers entered the royal palace in Alexandria. They did not come to execute her. They came to preserve her, not as a person but as property. Doors were sealed. Guards were stationed at every threshold. Messengers were screened. Objects were catalogued and removed. The war had ended. Her captivity was beginning. What happened in those final weeks was not a story of poison or serpents. It was a process, calculated, systematic, and designed to achieve something far more complete than death. This is what they actually did. When Octavian's forces entered Alexandria on August 1st, 30 BC, the city surrendered without siege. No walls were breached. No fires were set. The transition was administrative. Cleopatra remained inside her palace, but the palace was no longer hers. Roman soldiers arrived in formation. They did not storm the building. They occupied it. Entrances were reassigned. Interior routes were mapped. Certain rooms were sealed. Others were cleared. Guards were posted not to protect her, but to monitor her. Ancient sources describe the placement of sentries at specific intervals. Plutarch records that soldiers were instructed to prevent any act of self-harm. Dio Cassius notes that food was inspected before delivery. Sharp objects were removed. Mirrors were taken. Cosmetics were searched. This was not detention. It was specimen management. Cleopatra was allowed to move within designated areas. She could speak to attendants if those attendants were approved. She could send messages if those messages were reviewed. She could request items if those items were cleared. Every action required permission. Every permission was delayed. The palace still contained her belongings. Her furniture remained in place. Her clothes were accessible. But the structure itself had been recategorized. It was no longer a seat of power. It was a holding facility. Outside the palace, Alexandria continued functioning. Markets operated, temples opened, grain shipments were processed. Roman administrators began cataloging tax records, mapping property boundaries, and interviewing officials. Inside, time stopped. Cleopatra was not executed, not tortured, not interrogated. She was maintained. Days passed without resolution. Cleopatra sent requests to meet with Octavian. Those requests were acknowledged but not answered. Letters were delivered, but responses were delayed. Proposals were submitted, but decisions were postponed. Roman administration did not reject her outright. It processed her slowly. This delay was not accidental. Roman power operated through procedural control. Outcomes were determined not by refusal but by the management of time. Every unanswered message reinforced a single reality. She could no longer initiate action. Her daily routine became structured by absence. Meals arrived, but at irregular intervals. Attendants were present but rotated without pattern. Requests were logged, but fulfillment was suspended. The palace itself became a map of restriction. Certain corridors were accessible, others were closed. Some rooms remained furnished, others were emptied. The layout she had known for years was reorganized into zones of permission. This was not imprisonment in the traditional sense. It was spatial redefinition. Cleopatra had governed Egypt for 21 years. She had negotiated with Julius Caesar, commanded naval fleets, and managed an empire that stretched from Syria to Cyrenaic. She spoke 9 languages. She had overseen diplomatic summits, religious ceremonies, and military campaigns. None of that knowledge applied to her current situation. She could not negotiate with guards who were following orders. She could not command soldiers who were not under her authority. She could not leverage relationships that no longer existed. Every tool she had used to maintain power, persuasion, alliance, strategic delay, financial leverage, had been removed from the equation. What remained was her physical presence, and Rome had calculated the exact value of that presence. While Cleopatra remained under guard, Rome was already rewriting her identity. This process had begun years earlier. After the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's propaganda machine had systematically redefined Cleopatra in Roman consciousness. Official documents avoided her royal titles. Public speeches described her not as a monarch, but as a foreign influence. Coins stopped bearing her image. Written accounts emphasized seduction over statecraft. Her capture did not create this narrative, it finalized it. For Roman audiences, Cleopatra was no longer the pharaoh of Egypt, the descendant of Ptolemy, or the co-regent who had stabilized a fractured dynasty. She was an enemy of the state, documented, verified, and soon to be displayed. Roman law required physical evidence for a triumph. Victory was not declared, it was demonstrated. Enemies were presented in sequence. First their weapons, then their treasures, then their leaders. Cleopatra was being preserved for that sequence. But the process required more than her survival. It required her transformation from ruler to exhibit. This transformation happened through language. Roman officials stopped addressing her by title. Messages referred to her as the Egyptian or the woman. Diplomatic protocols that had once governed interactions with foreign monarchs were replaced with instructions for handling captives. Her authority was not stripped, it was reclassified. Inside the palace, this reclassification had physical consequences. Items associated with royal fun. Were removed first. Seals were confiscated. Ceremonial objects were catalogued. Official correspondence was collected. Anything that indicated administrative power was separated from her quarters. What remained were personal effects, but even these were sorted. Jewelry was inventoried. Cosmetics were examined. Clothing was inspected. The distinction between personal property and state assets was being determined by Roman assessors. Cleopatra was present during this process. She could observe the categorization of her own belongings, but she could not contest it. On August 3, 30 BC, 2 days after the occupation began, Cleopatra was granted an audience with Octavian. This was not a negotiation, it was an inspection. The meeting took place inside her own palace, but the room had been cleared by Roman soldiers. Guards stood at every entrance. The furniture had been rearranged. The space she had controlled for 2 decades was now configured for Roman purposes. Octavian entered with scribes, not advisors, scribes. The meeting was being documented. Ancient sources provide fragments of what was discussed. Cleopatra reportedly attempted to justify her alliance with Mark Antony. She presented financial records. She offered access to royal treasuries. She proposed terms for her children's safety. Octavian listened. He did not refuse her requests. He did not accept them. He acknowledged them. Then he left. The meeting lasted less than an hour. No agreements were formalized. No promises were made. No timeline was established. But the meeting served a function. It confirmed that Cleopatra still believed negotiation was possible, and that belief was useful to Rome because it meant she would continue behaving as though outcomes were still undecided. As long as she believed resolution was pending, she would remain compliant. She would not attempt to escape. She would not resistance. She would wait. And waiting was exactly what Rome needed her to do, because every day she waited was another day Rome could prepare the triumph. After the meeting, Plutarch records that Cleopatra believed she had made progress. She thought Octavian had shown clemency. She interpreted his restraint as flexibility. But Octavian's restraint was not clemency. It was Yuling. He had already determined her fate. He simply had not disclosed the timeline. Cleopatra's position had never rested solely on her own authority. It rested on succession. Her eldest son, Caesarion, publicly acknowledged as the biological child of Julius Caesar, represented a problem Rome could not parade. His existence complicated Octavian's narrative. If Julius Caesar had a legitimate heir, Octavian's claim to Caesar's legacy became disputable. A living son with royal and Roman lineage created a potential rallying point for opposition. Caesarion was 17 years old in 30 BC. He was sent away from Alexandria before the city fell, evacuated south toward the Red Sea with instructions to reach India if necessary, but he was recalled. Sources conflict on whether he returned voluntarily or was intercepted. What is certain, he was executed shortly after. The method is not recorded in detail. The decision was Octavian's advisor Arius is quoted by Plutarch. Too many Caesars is not good. Caesarion was removed from the equation. The other children were not. Cleopatra had 3 younger children with Mark Antony. Alexander Helios, age 10, Cleopatra Selene, age 10, and Tommy Philadelphia, age 6. They were taken into Roman custody alive. not as prisoners in the traditional sense. They were reassigned. Roman practice did not automatically execute the children of defeated enemies. It absorbed them. They were transported to Rome, placed in households, and raised under Roman supervision. Cleopatra Lie would later be married to Juba II, the Roman-appointed king of Mauritania. She would govern as queen, mint coins with her image, and produce heirs who would integrate into Roman imperial lineage. But that future was not presented to Cleopatra as reassurance, it was presented as removal. Her children would survive, but not as Egyptians, not as Tommies, not as heirs to her dynasty. They would continue as Roman assets. For Cleopatra, this clarified the terms of her situation. Rome did not need to kill her children to neutralize them. It only needed to relocate them. And once they were relocated, her leverage disappeared. She could not negotiate for their safety. They were already secure. She could not bargain for their release. They were already being processed. She could not protect their future, because that future was now being determined by Rome. This was not a threat, it was inventory redistribution. The separation happened gradually. First, the children were moved to different quarters within the palace, then they were assigned Roman attendants, then their daily schedules were restructured. Then they were taught Latin. Cleopatra was permitted to see them, but only at designated times, and those times became less frequent, not as punishment as transition. The children were being prepared for transport. They needed to be detached from Egyptian identity before they could be integrated into Roman society. That detachment required the removal of maternal influence. So visits were reduced, then supervised, then discontinued. By the time Cleopatra died, her children had already been relocated to a separate facility. They were not present when she died. They were already Roman property. Octavian's intention was clear from the moment Alexandria fell. Cleopatra would be brought to Rome alive, displayed, then archived. Roman triumphs followed strict procedural order. They were not celebrations. Were bureaucratic demonstrations of conquest. Every element was catalogued. Every participant had a designated position. The sequence was rigid. Magistrates and Senate members, trumpeters, carts carrying spoils, visual representations of conquered territories, sacrificial animals, captive leaders in chains, the victorious general, and the army. Cleopatra would have walked in position 6, not immediately, not first, last among the captives, after lesser officials, after symbolic figures, after anyone who could be presented as subordinate to her. The delay between positions was intentional. It allowed crowds to process each element. It created anticipation. It extended the duration of humiliation. Roman triumphs could last hours. Cleopatra would have spent that entire time walking through the streets, restrained, visible, and helpless. The route was predetermined from the Campus Martius, through the Circus Maximus, past the Forum, up to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. Every step would have been witnessed. Every witness would have been Roman. But this sequence required preparation. Captives had to be transported from conquered territories to Rome, a journey that could take weeks by ship. They had to be held in secure locations near the city. They had to be kept alive, presentable, and unable to escape. For Cleopatra, this meant months of waiting. Not in Alexandria, in transit, under guard, with no agency and no timeline. And here, the Roman calculation became precise. If Cleopatra died before the triumph could still proceed, but it would lack its central figure. If she died during the triumph, the spectacle would be disrupted. If she died after the triumph, she would be archived as a completed transaction. Rome preferred the third option, but the second option was acceptable. Only the first option, death before display, would represent failure. That timeline created pressure. Every day, Cleopatra remained alive and uncaptured extended the risk that she would find a way to exit the process on her own terms, and Octavian knew she was calculating the same timeline, so he accelerated the preparation. Ships were commissioned, transport schedules were drafted, holding facilities in Rome were inspected. The triumph was tentatively scheduled for the following year, but Cleopatra was not informed of these preparations. She was kept in procedural uncertainty because uncertainty prevented planning, and without planning she could not organize resistance. She could only react, and by the time she understood what was happening, the opportunity to act would have already passed. That was the design. On August 10, 30 BC, approximately 10 days after the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra died. The method remains debated. Ancient sources provide conflicting accounts. Plutarch describes an asp hidden in a basket of figs. Diocletian suggests poison. Strabo notes that no snake was found. Some historians propose a hollow hairpin. Others suggest assistance from guards. The mechanism is uncertain. The context is not. Cleopatra died before she could be transported to Rome, and Rome's response to that death reveals what her captivity had actually been designed to achieve. When informed of her death, Octavian did not change the triumph schedule. He adjusted the presentation. On August 13, 29 BC, nearly 1 year after Cleopatra's death, Octavian celebrated his triple triumph in Rome. The first triumph honored his victories in Irem. The second honored Actium. The third honored the conquest of Egypt. For the Egyptian triumph, Cleopatra appeared not in person as an image. Plutarch records that a large effigy of Cleopatra was carried through the streets, depicting her on a couch with an asp attached. The representation was sufficient. Roman law did not require the actual body of a defeated enemy, only verifiable evidence of their defeat. The effigy provided that evidence, and it carried additional advantages. Her living Cleopatra could have displayed resistance. She could have refused to walk. She could have spoken to the crowd. She could have created a moment of unpredictability. A representation could not. It was controllable, predictable, and repeatable. But the effigy was not displayed alone. Beside it, Cleopatra's 3 surviving children were paraded through the streets. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Tommy Philadelphia, ages 11, 11, and 7, walked in chains through Rome, while a statue of their mother was carried behind them. They were not harmed. They were evidence that Egypt was not merely conquered. It was absorbed. And this absorption did not require Cleopatra's cooperation. It only required her absence. The crowds who witnessed the triumph saw a carefully constructed narrative. The effigy showed Cleopatra in death, defeated, dramatic, contained. The children showed Egypt's future, Roman, manageable, integrated. Together they communicated a single message. The Tmic dynasty was over, not destroyed, concluded. After the triumph, the children were reassigned. They were placed in the household of Octavia, Octavian's sister, and Mark Antony's former wife. They were raised in Rome. They were educated in Latin. They were integrated into Roman social structures. Cleopatra Selene was later married to Juba II, a client king educated in Rome and installed as ruler of Mauritania. She became queen, minted coins, commissioned buildings, and governed a kingdom. But she did not govern Egypt. She did not restore the Tmic dynasty. She did not reclaim her mother's throne. Her survival was real. Her inheritance was not. The 2 sons, Alexander Helios and Tommy Philadelphia, disappear from historical records. After childhood, no dates of death are recorded, no marriages are mentioned, no positions are noted. They were absorbed into Roman society and erased from royal lineage. This was the final consequence of Cleopatra's captivity. Not her death, the redirection of her legacy. Rome did not need to erase Cleopatra from history. It needed to control which version of her survived. And it did. For 2,000 years, the dominant image of Cleopatra was not the multilingual diplomat who stabilized a collapsing dynasty. It was not the administrator who managed famine relief and economic reform. It was not the naval commander who deployed 60 ships at Actae. It was the seductress, the foreign threat, the tragic lover, the woman on the couch with the asp. That version was constructed in Rome, displayed in Rome, and transmitted through Roman sources. And Cleopatra was not present to contest it. Even her death became part of the narrative Rome wanted to tell. The asp, the symbol of Egyptian royalty, was repurposed as the instrument of her destruction. The pharaoh of Egypt was killed by her own symbol. That story was too perfect to be accidental. It was designed, and whether or not it was true became irrelevant because the story served Rome's purposes better than the truth. It showed Cleopatra as theatrical, irrational, and self-destructive. It positioned her death as an admission of defeat. It transformed a calculated exit into a romantic gesture, and that transformation lasted. Shakespeare immortalized the Asp. Hollywood visualized it. Popular culture repeated it. The version of Cleopatra that Rome created in 29 BC is the version that still dominates public consciousness. Not because it was accurate, because it was controlled. Cleopatra's final weeks were not defined by drama. They were defined by process. Surveillance without interrogation, detention without charge, delay without resolution, time without agency. Roman soldiers did not torture her. They did not humiliate her publicly. They did not force confessions. They simply removed her ability to determine outcomes. And once that ability was removed, her physical presence became optional. She could die, and the triumph would proceed. She could live, and the triumph would proceed. The outcome was identical. That realization was the mechanism, not the poison, not the snake. The understanding that survival and erasure could coexist. Cleopatra governed Egypt for 21 years. She outlasted sibling rivals, Roman civil wars, and political realignments. She negotiated with Julius Caesar, commanded Mark Annoni's fleet, and stabilized an empire that was fracturing at every border. But in her final days, she could not negotiate, command, or stabilize anything. She could only wait, and Rome had calculated exactly how long that waiting would last. Her children survived. Her dynasty did not. Her image endured. Her authority did not. She was preserved in history, but only in the version Rome chose to archive. That version was displayed in a triumph she never attended. It was recorded in sources she could not correct. It was transmitted through centuries she could not influence. The woman who spoke 9 languages had no voice in how she was remembered. The ruler who commanded fleets was reduced to a representation on a cart. The strategist who negotiated with Caesar was rewritten as a seductress. And all of this happened not through violence, but through substitution. Rome did not destroy Cleopatra. It replaced her with an image it could control, a narrative it could repeat, a legacy it could archive. That is what Roman soldiers did to Cleopatra. Not execution, substitution. History does not always destroy its enemies with violence. Sometimes it files them away. If stories like this matter to you, if you want to see the parts of history that were never meant to be examined, subscribe to Hidden Histories. There's more waiting inside.